This bill that's sitting on the governor's desk, I think this is, if signed, is just one more notch of not allowing public safety to do the right thing. Politics is getting in the way of public safety. Our job is to try to do the best we can to keep everyone safe. Maine law enforcement, Maine EMS, Maine fire really take that seriously. Sometimes it's difficult to get up and go to work for some of these folks just because you got somebody up here in Augusta that thinks they know your job better than you.
Sheriff Kevin Joyce, thank you very much for joining us in studio.
Thank you for having me.
The city of Portland and Cumberland County generally is a place where you've been working in law enforcement for a long time now, three decades plus.
Working on 4.
And you've seen, I think, a lot of changes to that area. I lived in Portland back in 2012, and even now I go to areas where I used to live, used to walk, and I've seen some changes myself too. Not really good changes. Can you tell me a little bit about what was the city like when you first started your law enforcement career in that area?
Well, it's when I reflect back, Munjoy Hill was a place where, I used to say that, there should be a sign that says drive fast, the life you save may be your own type thing. That's obviously turned around, and it's very, I wish I'd invested 40 years ago.
Gentrification.
Absolutely. I could have made some money on some property up there now. It's a beautiful area. The old port, they've cleaned that up, and it's a great place to hang out. But, with the homeless kind of fluctuating in, it's become a problem where, I'll drive through and my wife will even say, she grew up in South Portland, this isn't the Portland we're used to or what I remember it being. And, it's kind of tragic. I think the current mayor has done a good job about cleaning up the homeless and getting a new shelter that can accommodate some places, people. But the reality is you got some people that just won't go to the shelter. You could provide them a room at the Ritz-Carlton, and they're not going to go because they want to do their drugs, they want sex, they want to drink, and they don't want to follow the rules. So, it's kind of a disappointing scenario in the fact that you've got still a large number of people that you're just chasing around from one place in the city of Portland to the other. We have them, camping out on our property. Every 6 to 8 months, we have to move them along because where our jail is now, back when I first started in law enforcement, that was a hangout for all the homeless. And it was kind of like a jungle out there. So people would just hang out next to the railroad tracks, and nobody saw them. And I think probably that's the other thing is that when you build, you take down all of these places where these individuals want to hide and be out of sight, and now they're in your face, whether you drive by Daring Oaks or you drive through Monument Square.
It seems that the homelessness crisis has abated somewhat from 1 or 2 years ago when you had the Four River Parkway was a very large encampment. The Marginal Way Park and Ride was a very large encampment, and the city and the county and the state were playing hot potato a little bit, pushing the encampment around and trying to push responsibility onto a different entity. Where have all those people gone? Are they just dispersed throughout the city? Are they in other communities? What exactly was the solution there, such as it is?
Well,
if you can call it a solution.
I'm at arm's length with the homeless situation because, I'm the end result. If people don't
You're the
agree,
final boss.
They come to the jail.
Yeah.
And you know what? They're going to be released at some point, so that's not a good answer either. But I think, some have gone to the shelters. There are some people that they're homeless, one tragic thing and I could be homeless, right? So those folks have taken advantage of some of the services and gotten on their feet. Some still hang out at the homeless shelter, which is at least good. They get a roof over their head and 3 square meals. You've got people still hanging out, in Monument Square periodically. Saw the news last night, there was an encampment near the high school. Daring Oaks, out on Forest Avenue, close to the homeless shelter. There are people that almost get there, but they'd rather live in a tent and, finding needles, et cetera. So, I call those individuals, and I think I've gotten it from other people, that those are the people that just don't want to comply. They want their dog. They want to, like I said, do drugs, drink, and just live lawless, and they probably have serious mental illness. And what do you do for them? I reflect back to an individual that was homeless out in the rural areas of Cumberland County, and my staff worked with them. And we had a day where it was going to go to 20 below zero at night. And this individual, I knew him. He was very smart, but mentally he snapped in college, and you could not rationalize with this person. And I told him that I would pay to put him in a Days Inn down in Portland just through the night so they wouldn't freeze to death. And, sending out a deputy to go actually transport him into Portland, he wouldn't get in the cruiser, and he wanted to live, he just didn't want to comply. And you can't force people to comply. So I think that's where the city, their hands are tied in some ways. And, as they say with, you keep doing something over and over again, thinking you're going to get a different result, and it doesn't happen. That's insanity. And, I think the city needs to start looking at what other ways can they do it. These individuals likely are mentally ill. They definitely have some substance use disorders. If they don't want to go to a facility, you can't force them. And really, the only thing they do is wait until they commit a misdemeanor crime. The police department, they work their tail off to try to clean up the city and keep things going. And, I feel bad for them, because it's like plugging a hole in a dam. You plug one and two more empty up. They bring them down to our facility, but they're going to get out again because, absent committing a real serious crime, people are entitled to bail. Judges are going to release them, and they're going to be back out on the street, and nothing's changed. Nothing.
I think one of the issues that Portland is dealing with is similar to what San Francisco dealt with, which is the involuntary homeless versus the voluntary homeless. The people who have the shelter made available to them. And the Supreme Court has made a distinction between how those two classes of individuals can be handled. What do you think is the proper response? If you're emperor of Cumberland County for a week, what is the proper response for dealing with the involuntary homeless, people who have had, a night at a Days Inn, a spot at Preble Street, medical treatment offered to them, but they say, no, I'd rather sleep in a tent on the corner of a baseball field and use drugs?
So obviously using the drugs is, causing, it's committing a crime. Just somebody refusing to go to a shelter per se. There's no law that makes that illegal. And I think
in some places there are. In Iceland, there's vagrancy laws. I mean,
right.
It has been done. Some Western societies have vagrancy laws where you cannot be voluntarily homeless, living on the street, causing a public nuisance.
And something has to be done legislatively if that's going to happen. I think that the jail has been made to be the opportunity of last resort for people. We're the largest mental health facility. We're the largest drug addiction recovery facility, only we don't cause people to recover because we don't have them long enough. And, for those individuals, if we can find a law that they violated, they're brought down to the jail, but they're going to get out, and we're not going to fix them because we don't have them long enough. So I think the city needs to start looking at providing some services that are mental health related, substance abuse related. They have some, the harm reduction, I believe in harm reduction to a point, but I think it goes a little over. I think that I'm required to do medication assisted treatment at the jail. Maybe the
Suboxone?
Suboxone, whatever's medically necessary. The doctor.
I mean, that's a pretty big category. Whatever's medically necessary.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's some that medication assisted treatment doesn't. An individual's not a candidate for that. There's some that Suboxone, there are other medications that can be given if the doctor decides to do it. It's a cost to us, and
How-
we're expected
how much
to do
how
that.
much about a year do you think the medication assisted treatment costs? Because
it
I
probably-
know in Maine we've gone from about 7,000 covered on Maine Care to 8,000 since it started being covered by Maine Care. So
Yeah.
the number of people taking Suboxone, at least through government paid programs, has grown significantly year over year.
It's probably pushing almost 1 million. I mean, we give a lot of psychotropic medications too, and I'm always after the medical staff to try to make sure that that's medically necessary, not from my standard, but what a doctor's standard is. There have been times when I've heard people come into jail and say, "Geez, I need this medication so I can sleep." Well, it's jail. We're not going to give it unless it's medically necessary.
Yeah.
So when we talk about medically necessary, I have an individual now that was supposed to have stomach bariatric treatment. Well, that's not medically necessary.
The weight loss.
Yeah. So we're not obligated to do that. But we have a lot of sick individuals that are coming into the jail, like unprecedented. So my budget for medical is gone from about $2 million 15 years ago to we're pushing almost $4 million now. And that's just for, medical services, the staff, mental health, medication assisted treatment, hospital details. My hospital details in the last year and a half have been through the roof. Sometimes I have people in the hospital where I've got to have corrections officers, or sometimes we use police officers more often than not to sit on these individuals in the hospital because they're still in custody, but they need to be at the hospital, not at the jail.
What do you think the root cause of that is?
Obviously we're dealing with people that don't see doctors. We have people, I very rarely at a point did I go see a doctor because I was young and, fearless type thing. But we have people that, probably haven't seen a doctor ever or for years. They're using drugs, and obviously some drugs just tear down the system internally and externally. And again, we have an obligation to make sure that they get the emergency treatment. As I tell my staff, we can get a pound of flesh afterwards, but we got to make sure medically that they're in a hospital. Mental health, same thing. Sometimes we're fighting to get people in Riverview because it's like, it's like treating an animal if you keep them in jail because they need medical assistance first. We'll get a pound of flesh afterwards, once they're stabilized. So we're always trying to stabilize people that are coming in under the influence of drugs, under the influence of alcohol, under, medically or mentally ill. And we're an emergency room. And as I tell my intake staff, we know people are coming. We don't know when they're going to show up. We don't know how many are going to show up. But we know that most cases, they're going to need something. And it's the jail is kind of immersed from what jails were originally set for, were, to take people that were a threat to public safety and keep them off the street, or to make sure people showed up in court and make sure that they didn't abscond. But now we're using it as a treatment facility and a way to get people out of the community with the hopes that, okay, they're in jail, things are going to be better. And I tell people, we don't have them long enough to fix. The average stay is between 20 and 27 days. You can't do any drug treatment in that period of time. We can stabilize them. We can get them out of withdrawals and make sure they live through withdrawals. That's the highest risk time for us. We can try to get them mentally stabilized, but there's only a certain point that you can go with that. And then you need higher mental health services. And it's really a high risk for us because that's when people are more prone to suicide in the first 2 or 3 days. So our staff does a phenomenal job of trying to mitigate the hundreds of people we see every year.
You mentioned briefly harm reduction. I think that's the philosophy or school of thought when it comes to addiction treatment that has been embraced pretty thoroughly over the last 6 years. And the most acute way that people see that is through the needle exchanges, or at least they used to be exchanges. We've covered quite a bit how during COVID, the exchange requirement was lifted from a 1-to-1 requirement where you bring in a used needle to get a clean needle. It was changed to, if you go there, you get a box with 100 clean needles. I think maybe the exchange requirement now is 1 dirty needle for 100 clean needles. So we don't really have an exchange program as much as we have a giving away clean needles. And I actually had a reporter who went into what they call the exchange and asked for the full kit. And he was giving boofing kits, needleless syringes to squirt drugs up his butt, as well as some clean needles. Do you think that that kind of program is helping anyone?
Well, the 1 to 100, I heard another community talking about that recently, and it was like, I turn in 1 needle and I get 100. I mean, that to me is like overkill. The rationale between the harm reduction was that, hey, we're going to make sure that people aren't using dirty needles, sharing dirty needles, and AIDS epidemic starts and other communicable diseases. And there's a fair amount of...
But then we had the largest case of AIDS and hepatitis B outbreak in Bangor, right where the needle exchange was.
Yeah. So, I mean,
the most active.
People are still going to do it. But, this 1 to 100 just seems a little bit of a head scratcher. Again, I'm expected to provide medication assisted treatment in an area that we're not, I've got a medical department that makes sure that happens. But, how about some medication assisted treatment with these individuals? The reality is these individuals are wired to crave the drug. So you got to take care of that, but there's also a way you can try to wean them off it. And they shouldn't have to go to jail to get the services that right now we're offering. I've often said that whether it's mental illness or medication assisted treatment, I've had people come into jail. That's when they get the services. How about taking care of it up the river a little bit so they don't come into jail? Because coming into jail and having me try to fix it, and I just told you, I'm not fixing it. That's an expensive way, An
expensive way to not fix the problem.
Exactly. Yeah. We're just, it's a dog chasing its tail. It's a revolving door. And how about the individuals that, realize there's a mental illness or substance use? I'm stopped in the store quite often, not as much lately, but when this pre-COVID, with parents coming up going, hey, is there a way that I can get my son or daughter some help with substance use? And, I try to reach out to people. We got it figured out once they get in jail, but we don't have it figured out beforehand. And I don't think jail is the place we should be doing it. Again, the jails were built to keep bad guys off the street and make sure people didn't abscond from going to court. We're using it now for every social service that anybody can think of because we have a captive audience. I'm okay. Our mantra is we're going to take people and we're going to release them better than they came in for a short period of time, probably. But we're trying to dip out the ocean with a spoon.
And you have necessarily limited resources and limited man hours. So I would imagine that the time, money, and effort and energy that you're spending dealing with the dog chasing its tail cuts into the time that you could be spending doing what are the core functions of a jail or a sheriff's office. What are the costs, or what are the trade-offs of having to spend so much time dealing with that constant churn of acute mental health crises?
So pre-COVID and pre the Great Resignation, if you will, where people were reevaluating their lives and what they wanted to do with their careers.
Yeah, I bought a camper van and drove all around the country. I was part of that. I dropped out of society.
And a lot of people did. Hey, I don't blame them. The reality is we had a lot of programs because we were trying to fix people the best we could. Whether it was trying to teach them how to write a resume so they can get a job, whether it was trying to get an ID so they can go out and get a job or do the things that we take for granted that we can do. We had programs where we brought people in to tell people how to do a checkbook. And just the things that we take for granted. I remember when I first took over as sheriff, I had asked, we had a work crew around the jail facility, and I asked them to kind of sweep. It was early spring, and where the sand from the winter had collected, and I said, hey, can you get some inmates and get them to sweep? Well, I expected push brooms, but I looked out and I saw like 4 or 5 guys with little brushes and little dustpans. And, I scratched my head. So I brought the guy over, the corrections officer was overseeing him. He goes, you don't understand. Some of these people have no idea the concept of clean. So I have to teach that. And, right now, their idea is a little dustpan that you see, at a amusement park. Guy just, and that's how they were cleaning up the sand. The bottom line is that we try to offer programming, but, I've got some staffing challenges. And, quite frankly, the core of what we're doing now is keeping people safe and secure in a humane manner. The programs come afterwards. We do have some programs that we offer within the jail, but we had a blue ribbon program called a Community Corrections Center where we had 3 groups of people. People that, were at the end of their release, and we worked with them to, it was a dormitory situation. They paid us rent. Some went out to work, came back at the end of the day. Some worked on the property, cleaning that up, and some actually went out for the day with a corrections officer and did some beautifications to the towns and churches, et cetera, that nonprofits. And that was a good program. Right now, we're hobbled by that. But there's I think if we can somehow get people in the right direction, we're not going to fix everyone. But if we fix a couple people, and point them in the right direction, get them on MAT and get them hooked up with services when they get released, hook them up with a job, hook them up with, transportation and stuff like that. We can fix 1 or 2, and 1 or 2 over a period of time becomes 6, 8, 10. But we often focus on, we got to fix them all. You can't fix everybody. There's some people that you're not going to fix because they don't want to be fixed, going back to the homeless. You can give them a room at the Ritz-Carlton. They don't want to do that because they might have to follow rules. So it's really a complicated world, and trying to, push people in the right direction to do the right thing. And in a sick and twisted way, I guess that's why I come to work each and every day, is to try to figure out how do we make tomorrow better than it was yesterday.
What percentage of all the people coming through your jail, through the sheriff's office, would you say are there because of drugs? What I guess percentage of crime stems from drugs?
So I use about 80% are co-occurring, mental illness and substance use. That's a lot. So out of 425, 80% of those have some form of mental illness or substance use, or both. That's a lot. It used to be about 65%. But again, it's somehow it's ratcheting up, and I have no explanation for it other than we have to change to try to figure out how to take care of these folks and try to find out what the root cause is.
Have you seen the nature of the drug problems change through your career? I mean, I imagine fentanyl, the beginning of your career, wasn't around as much. It was more of a medical obscurity. So that's got to be a new one. But how has the drug picture changed?
When I started, it was marijuana and cocaine, right? I mean, those were the big things. And then all of these other drugs were just unheard of. And then
these are marijuana products that I bought at a convenience store in my hometown of Dexter, Maine.
Oh, really?
It's changed a little bit since you started.
Yeah. And then, because we had the pill form of narcotics, probably
like Oxycontin, Percocet, and Purdue
it was
Pharma.
Big in like northern Maine. So that coined the name hillbilly heroin. Mm-hmm. And now it's, the full on narcotics. Yeah. You still have the Oxycontins and oxycodones, but you got fentanyl and heroin's kind of dissipating. Methamphetamine there was a time when people, oh, geez, methamphetamine is really, yeah, it hadn't made its way from the West Coast to the East Coast, but it's here. So we've kind of grown into all of these drugs that are just, as I told my doctor once, I came into the world not on medications. I want to leave the world not on medications because I believe that, I don't want to put stuff I don't know what the heck is in my body. And he laughed. But, the reality is people have no issue putting stuff that they buy off the street, have no idea what's in it. And they have no issue with taking it. And unfortunately, the fentanyl is just like super deadly. And I've gone to some trainings where they're making it just over the border in Mexico, in areas that are pretty dirty. And there's no regulations. And I'm trying to think, 7 out of 10 pills, I think, are probably, because there's no regulation, are going to be deadly.
A hot shot.
Yeah. So, but again, you can't rationalize with people that, they're wired to have it. They got to have it. I correlate it to, I love sugar, right? My drug of choice. And sometimes you have one and that becomes 2 or 3 or 4. Same thing with fentanyl, they got to have it and they don't really care. And trying to rationalize with somebody that has got to have it, becomes an issue.
We spent a lot of time going into some of the homeless encampments and talking to people, whether it was Bangor, Sanford, or Portland, just to try to understand, what's their story, why they're there. And there was a couple that we talked with that has stuck with me. Ashley and Drew, young couple, they might have been 20, 22, and they'd lived in a tent through the winter on the corner of the baseball field off of Deering Oak Park. Mm-hmm. And they, got through the winter by burning hand sanitizer in a Weber grill to stay warm. And Drew said he'd been Narcan something like 8 or 9 times. And they were otherwise fit, could be working. Drew's dad lived just over in Old Orchard Beach or something, but found him blue and overdosing on a couch one day and kicked him out of the house and said, I'd rather read about you in the news than find you at home. And they explained to me that neither of them wanted to be in that situation. They didn't want to be using, but they couldn't see a clear pathway to, treatment and a life post fentanyl. And the dope sickness that they would get when they hadn't used was so extraordinary. And when you're faced with the idea of, am I just going to sit here and have flu-like symptoms and be cold in a tent in Portland, or just use, this $2, $4, $5 hit of whatever and make those feelings go away? And it really helped me empathize with their situation. And I've thought that if I was in that situation, I'd probably just want, I'd want you to lock me up for a period of 30 to 60 days, regardless of how comfortable the situation is, but get that craving out of your head so that you can think clearly and make drug impaired decisions about your future and what you want to do. So it almost seems to me that the humane thing is actually to take away these people's freedom to use. But I don't see that thinking as much on some of the, left-wing people who view unlimited freedom as the only way to humanely treat substance use disorder.
That's why I said earlier, for some people, medication-assisted treatment's good, effective. According to some doctors, it's not. Abstinence is the way to go with medical or mental health treatment. I had a similar situation where a TV media wanted to come in and interview some inmates. And I sat in on it, and one individual had a substance use disorder. And he got out of jail. He had a family. He had a job, but he violated his probation. And he also had a warrant for his arrest. So he got picked up again. And he said, I've got a family. I didn't pay my fine. There were a bunch of different things. I'm listening to it. But he had a job and he's trying to provide for his family. But his addiction took over. So my guess is, and listening to him, it became addiction first, family, and then paying my my fine off, which ended up getting him in jail. But he also said that I always feel safer when I'm in jail because I'm not using. And he said, if I get released, 15 minutes, I'll find some drugs. So as much as I want to be with my family, as much as I want to be out working, I'm having a hard time battling that, and I feel safe in jail. That shouldn't happen. But I can't relate, you can't relate, thankfully, to all of what's going on in this guy's head. So, there is I'm obligated to hold them until they get released or they make bail. And that became some of the issue that the city councilor had is I should be keeping these folks and working on their mental illness and substance use. Well, they have a right to bail, and I can't keep them beyond that. A judge determines that they're going to be released. Well, I can't keep them beyond that. So, unless somebody does something serious, trying to lock them up and keep them separated from drugs is kind of difficult with the rules we have today because, as my chief deputy often says, for some of these minor things, people are going to get out. They're going to eventually get out, so what can we do while we have them? And it's a struggle. It's a struggle.
Well, I guess one of the things we're circling around is the recidivism issue. We had the chief of police, Eric Small from Sanford, was in here, and he said that I think the record was like 23 bail conditions on someone that they had arrested. There is a lot of criticism directed your way because of the recidivism issue, people getting released sometimes within 24 hours. Mm-hmm. What can we do, I guess, at the state level or at the city level in order to make sure that we don't have this revolving door where people are, assaulting strangers on the street, openly using drugs, doing public nuisance crimes, breaking into cars, what have you? How do we fix that revolving door process? Is it as simple as going back to the 3 strikes and you're out, you're into a longer term custody?
So I've often said the criminal justice system right now is broken. It needs some fixing. Legislatively, it's often brought up that we need to go through the statutes and make sure that, there are certain areas that don't necessarily coincide with others. There's certain areas that maybe needs to be thrown out. And I heard this at the legislature the last session is, it's going to be expensive, so we can't do it. I think that, first of all, we need to clean up some of the statutes and make sure they're relevant to what's going on today. I'll use, for instance, you can still read about a jailer, Now, if you're into history, I guess the jailer is me. It might be my jail administrator, but we kind of need to get up in times. There was talk about bail reform. Well, I think, it's kind of like the old engines in cars. And when you tune a carburetor, if you turn the screw a little bit too much, the car doesn't run very good. And you turn it back the other way, it doesn't run good. There's a sweet spot. Bail reform, we're starting to see individuals that are given no bail and released, and then they're brought back in, and then it becomes a bail revocation. And some people are being brought back in 2 or 3 times and then lingering. I don't know what the sweet spot is for that, but we got to make it so that individuals don't continue to reoffend. I've had, and I haven't checked this in a while, but about 10 years ago, we had one individual been arrested 60 some odd times in the course of a year, been in our jail 60 some odd times. There's a problem there. 2 years ago, 3 years ago, my staff were tired coming out of COVID. And I said, I'm only going to accept certain arrests coming in. They got to be violent. We're not going to do the soccer mom doing 30 over, even though it's an arrestable offense, type thing, because I got to take care of my staff, or we're not going to have any jail. And, you won't have jail to bring people to. So, you know, I took some hits and rightfully so from the city of Portland because they couldn't arrest some of these individuals unless they smacked somebody. They couldn't arrest them for, you know, loitering or urinating public and stuff. And again, didn't like to do that, but I had to take care of my staff, you know. Sometimes I just have to make decisions that is like the right thing, you know. You know, some judges came in, you know, called me in and said, hey, what's your authority? And I go, well, I don't have any authority, to be honest with you, but I have an obligation to run a safe jail. And I got a bunch of staff that are just, they're walking around like mummies and zombies because they're so tired trying to do everything that the towns and cities of Cumberland County expect, the police departments expect, and everybody else expects. And that affected what went on in the city of Portland as well, you know, and I take ownership for that period of time. But since then, we've been open and ready for business, and we're taking people on, and, you know, our staffing is marginally better, but, you know, we're by no means to the staffing level we were pre-COVID. And so we do the best we possibly can. You know, one question's asked about recidivism. You know, what's your recidivism rate? I have no idea, because you actually have to follow these people. And, you know, somebody may do something in Cumberland County, and we know that if they if they come back through, we can measure that recidivism. But if somebody from Bangor gets arrested in Portland and we have them, then they get released, they go back to Bangor, we're not going to necessarily know how many times that person reoffends in Bangor. So trying to do the recidivism is a true, accurate rating is pretty difficult, because I don't have the staff to follow them and track them once they leave and see what they're doing in other counties, let alone other states.
If you had to guess what rate of people who come through the jail are, you know, frequent flyers, you know, 3, 4, 5 times they've been through the door.
Fair amount.
Yeah.
Fair amount. I mean, you know, when I'm recognizing names in the pass downs, I get a shift passed down and stuff. It's like, oh, here we go. You know, and again, I'm not working with these folks. I'm not dealing with these folks on a daily basis.
Yeah.
There's a fair amount. And a lot of them are the homeless, you know. I think where I was going to go when shutting down the jail was, one of the comments I made is, for a homeless individual that's mentally ill, the police officer walking up and telling him not to do something or her not to do something, that's not a deterrent. And writing the person a summons to go to court, because they'll generally probably not make it to court, is not a deterrent. And quite frankly, making an arrest and being released 2 hours, 8 hours, 16 hours, 24 hours later is not a deterrent for these folks too, because they become the frequent flyers of the world and stuff. So we got to find a way.
It sounds like there's no deterrent.
No, there isn't. There isn't. And in some cases, some of these folks just don't make it into the court, you know? So it becomes kind of this, I see it in the public, we move it into the jail, things are good for now. Oh my God, he's back out, you know? And it just becomes back and forth. And I give this a lot of thought on what could be the deterrent. And I just don't, I guess I'm not that smart to figure it out. But
I mean, is it as simple as going back to when we had, you know, when I was a kid, people used to joke about Acadia, the Acadia Mental Health Institution,
Okay, yeah.
and then Bangor Mental Health.
Yeah.
Is it as simple as going back to the institutions where people who have that severe mental illness can be kept in a situation that's, you know, more humane and less punitive than a jail setting? Is that something that would relieve some of the pressure that your system has?
Well, you know, it's
revolving
funny.
door.
They say history repeats itself, right? You know, and before I came into law enforcement, they shut down Pineland and some of those other places.
This was Reagan, right?
Yeah.
Reagan's big thing was shutting down all of these places.
And I've heard stories. I don't know. I mean, I've heard stories that are pretty bad, you know. But again, this is 2025. We've kind of moved on, and we've developed and professionalized, et cetera. I'd like to think.
We won't have to go back to doing lobotomies,
right, yeah,
at the West Allegheny
exactly.
Lunatic Asylum,
or the white jackets and stuff like that. I've got one town that we patrol that has 20 group homes in it, and at least 2 or 3 we have frequent flyers there.
And the group homes are
mental health.
Okay.
Where they buy a home in a neighborhood, they don't tell anybody, and all of a sudden it becomes a group home. And, for mentally ill people.
Autism or intellectual and developmental disorders.
I think all of the above type thing. So I mean, again, when I read the law enforcement pass downs, I'm constantly reading about certain clients that, maybe they have an infatuation with the deputy and their uniform. So they're putting glass in their ears and their rectum and, just to get somebody to respond. I don't.
There's got to be easier ways to get attention than putting glass in your rectum.
I can't relate to it. I'm just telling you, that's what, I mean, but the reality is our mental health system is broken,
and I think everybody would agree with that. Regardless of your politics, I think everybody would agree. They might not agree on what the eventual solution is, but they would agree that what we're doing now, it's not working.
And people say, "Hey, we'll build a hospital." Well, how are you going to staff it? I mean,
and you couldn't right now because of certificate of need.
Right, but let's say you could.
Yeah.
I mean, I have a hard time hiring, my medical provider has a hard time hiring nurses because it's a revolving door. There's it's off to the next best deal. Same thing with social workers and mental health workers. Same thing with corrections officers. Same thing for law enforcement. So you can build a nice building, but if you can't staff it, but the system needs to be able to take a lot of this mental illness that just keeps reoccurring and try to find different ways to fix it. I mean, the 3 frequent flyers, if they do something bad enough, they end up in the jail and then they become a problem for the other part of my staff, So again, I don't know what that answer is. I'm not a psychologist, but the reality is we're operating insanity. We keep going back to this place thinking that, on the 26th time we go back there, things are going to change. We won't go back for the 27th. And it's not working that way. And I don't have an answer. I don't have an answer. I have some thoughts. And part of it is we just need to bolster our mental health and start taking some of these folks that are having a hard time in the community and making them maybe not stay there, but putting them into the system. I've seen some very serious mental illness in the jail that people would just be on awe about. Painting with fecal matter, urinating in milk containers, and then defecating in milk containers. And when the corrections officer walks by, stamping on it and having that stuff come out under the door and get all of their uniforms. I mean, my corrections staff, they do wonders each and every day because the law enforcement staff, they deal with the individual, bring them in, but it's the correction staff that for 8 hours a day or sometimes 16 hours, if we force them over or they stay over, are dealing with these folks. And the number of people that do things with defecation and urination would make people just go, I can't believe it. Some people say it's behavioral. Some people say it's mental illness. Honestly, again, I can't relate to that, but it's terrible when you hear some of the things that some people are doing. And that's why I say those folks, we'll get them in jail eventually, but we need to fix what's going on up here.
I was going to ask about workforce challenges. I would, in the prospective employee brochure, I wouldn't lead with the milk cartons full of feces getting stamped on, but
that's reality.
Yeah.
I mean, and you're right.
What would you say are your workforce challenges? What are the big things that are preventing you from being able to hire corrections officers, whether they're people who are already located in Maine or people who might prospectively come to Maine, live in Cumberland County, and work for you?
So one of the things that I do a lot of thinking on is trying to make the corrections profession. When I first started, there were 300 applicants for one police job. I didn't work in the jail. I competed and was able to get a law enforcement job. But those who couldn't get into law enforcement went into corrections because it's a great training ground and it's a great way to learn how to interact with others. And quite frankly, over half of my law enforcement started out in the jail. And as young deputies were a lot better than I was because they knew the players. They knew the players and who they hung out with. They knew the lingo. And I had to learn that just by trial and tribulation, if you will. Unfortunately, with corrections, it shouldn't be this way, but it's kind of like a step down. It's considered a step down. And we need to make it that it isn't. I'm often telling my folks in corrections that, look, you are making an impact to your community. For the one or two that go out and never come back, and there are those. I mean, there are people that come up to me in the public and say, hey, stayed in your jail, and I'm so glad I'm out and I'm never going back, and your staff, saved me from doing X, Y, Z. They are making an impact. The unfortunate thing is when they're doing their job every day, it's not newsworthy. When they screw up, it's on the front page for a week, and when you hire from the human race, there are going to be people that screw up, or there's going to be a death in custody. I also say that, people dying in the hospital every day, but when somebody dies in custody, it's automatic that, it had to have been reason. And it could be just that it was medical. So I think that trying to reinvigorate the corrections profession and, give them the ability to try to make some impact on the people we deal with on a day-to-day basis. I've had some seasoned corrections officers that have gotten into some programming, and I thought, geez, that's going to be hard because he's pre-seasoned and, but, bringing in things like yoga for females and stuff, keeping them busy because, if you keep inmates busy, then they don't have time to do other things.
Fill the milk containers.
Yeah, and trying to push that out as good news. Good news doesn't sell. We know that. But trying to get that out and say, look, this is what we are doing to help people out. Whether or not it works or not, we're at least trying, And that becomes kind of what I think about every day is how do I make that so people do want to come in? Because you're right. I mean, a nurse is probably going to see that to a certain extent, especially in a mental health hospital as well, But God bless these guys because they do come in and try to do the best they can each and every day, keep it quiet, keep people, positively moving in the right direction and trying to make sure that when we open the door for them to be released, at least for that moment in time, they're better than they were when they came in. We also have some release planners that try to set people up so that, they have clothing. Some people are arrested with not a lot. I mean, if somebody's arrested in July and they're released in December, they're probably not going to have winter jackets and stuff. So, we have people go out and get winter jackets at Goodwill and stuff so they have something to go with. We make sure that they have some sort of ID so they can cash a check or something, if they have a job. It's a real fluid and busy operation. I'd like to think we're A+, but, sometimes, I feel like we got to up our game a little bit, but you can only do that with staff. And, when you got staff that are working 16 hours a day, you can only do so much. And like I said, the public expects, during COVID, I mean, we took our numbers and drove them down to about 200 and we were at like 425. We're a congregate facility. So I'd rather deal with 200 infected inmates than 400. And I would talk to friends that own restaurants and stuff. And, during the COVID, they shut down periodically certain areas of the restaurant. If staffing, they only open certain areas. I said, geez, I wish I could do that. Yeah. But again, it goes back to, I know they're coming. I don't know how many. and we got to make it work.
One of the things that has had you and the Cumberland County Sheriff's Office in the news lately has been your relationship with ICE. You guys are a holding facility for some of the immigration detainees before they're processed out of the Scarborough ICE facility. And you've drawn some attention from political activists. I mean, you guys aren't unique in this. There's nationally across the state, there's been this political effort to divorce law enforcement at the state level from federal immigration work. There's a bill right now kind of hanging out there in the ether that the governor may or may not sign that would force state police agencies to stop cooperating with federal immigration authorities. Can you talk a little bit at first about just your relationship over the past 10, 15 years with federal immigration authorities? How does that actually work? And what does that look like in practice?
So I'd go back 32 years. I mean, the jail was built in 1992, 93, opened. And, from day one, we held federal inmates. The U.S. Marshals gave $1 million to the Cumberland County Commissioners back in 92, 93, so that for 20 years, that they would always have beds. This is U.S. Marshals. ICE piggybacked on that. And, I do have some relationship because even as a young deputy, I worked part-time for the old Immigration and Naturalization Service part-time to make some extra money. And so I got a glimpse at what immigration does as well. So oftentimes my job for immigration was to go to the Cumberland County Jail and pick somebody up and either take them to the airport for deportation or take them to the court in Boston. And I got a glimpse of their work. So the reality is, as I tell people, first of all, there's legal and there's illegal immigration. Not everyone that's brown that has a dialect that doesn't sound English is illegal. They could be legal, and nobody has a scarlet letter that differentiates. So our relationship with ICE has been, we've held ICE inmates for the last 32 years. Sometimes there's none, sometimes there's 10, and right now there's about 64 in the jail. The other reality is, back in 92, 93, the jail funding, like it or not, was a two-legged stool. It was federal revenue and county property tax. I remember as a chief deputy, a county commissioner asking if we could arrest, or we could reach out to the feds to arrest more people because they needed that federal revenue to offset the property taxpayers. And then in 2008, when the jail, the legislature, created a jail board, that really screwed things up. And now the state of Maine is part of the funding formula. So in Cumberland County, the Cumberland County Jail is a three-legged stool. It's property taxpayers, not to exceed 4%. State funding, which is, we're always groveling for that because, for whatever reason, we don't do things good enough, or we're not doing something right or whatever. So we never get what we really need, even though our numbers are showing that we need the money.
Well, the people at the State House need power,
Yeah. And then you have the federal revenue. And again, that equates to $2.5–3 million, whether it's marshals or ICE inmates. The bottom line is, for 32 years, we haven't changed. The numbers have fluctuated. The administration in D.C. has fluctuated, and their priorities have changed. But the reality is, this is not anything new. But all of a sudden, in 2025, it became an issue. And part of it is to get back at D.C.
Yeah.
And trying to fend off some of the things they're seeing about ICE. I see some things on TV and I scratch my head, about some of the tactics. But again, I'm realistic to know that I don't know what happened before or after. I probably wouldn't do that, but, again, not for me to sit and judge based on a little 2-second clip. As far as enforcing immigration law, I'll be the first to tell you that my experience with immigration is we as state and local law enforcement have no business whatsoever of locking somebody up because we think they're illegal. It's a great way for an agency to get sued. Going back to that, I mean, I had friends who were investigators and stuff, and I would ask questions. Immigration law is like completely different than any other law that we as state and local deal with. I pulled a statute, I guess, on a case that one of our ICE inmates was locked up for, 150 pages. By the time I got done reading, I'm not sure I understood what the heck it was. And by the time I got done, I forgot what I was doing. I mean, 150 pages on this one law. So I've told my staff that, we're not doing ICE enforcement. If you find somebody that you think is something that ICE is interested in, you write a statement and you forward it off to them and they can decide whether or not they want to follow up. It's not any different than working with OSHA. We know that somebody falls off a roof and they probably should have had some sort of a belt on or something. We're going to do our report, forward it to OSHA. OSHA can determine whether or not it fits into a law that they can charge somebody, or FAA, whatever. So my staff has been told, hey, if you have something, write a statement, send it over. They can follow up on it. We will always back them up if they call for assistance, like screaming for assistance, much like we would do for the state police, Portland police, or whatever. We will always make sure a law enforcement officer goes home at the end of the day. And, that's not negotiable. And I've told my staff, if ICE does call and they want to do an operation and they need help, then I will make that decision based on, exactly what it is. It might be just we're directing traffic. It might be that we're standing on the road, and if they scream for help, we're helping them. But again, it's a great way to get sued of playing outside your lane. And quite frankly, they offer up a 287G, and I did some research on that. It's a 40-hour online course, and then we get blessed to enforce laws. I mean, 40 hours is not a lot and a great way to get sued. I did some research in 2017 because back then, and for a long time, ICE would just call over to the jail and say, hey, you got so-and-so, hold them for 48 hours until we can get some paperwork over. And, I ran into some issues there because I said, no, we're not doing that. I want probable cause because I'll get sued, not ICE. I'll get sued because other sheriffs have been sued in the past for holding people beyond their release date when there was no probable cause, only to find out that they were a U.S. citizen, or ICE forgot that they were locked up, and the 7 days later, somebody called and said, hey, what are you doing with this guy? Oh, you can release him. We forgot to call you. Well, it was the jails or the sheriffs that got sued, not ICE. So, I try to follow what's going to protect the county, the taxpayers of Cumberland County, and try to do the public safety as best I can. And it's not a bright blue line whatsoever.
So in a circumstance where a Cumberland County Sheriff's deputy pulls over, it's a traffic stop and there are passengers, driver exhibiting signs of, not speaking English, no driver's license, that kind of thing. Is that a situation where you would call the local Customs and Border Protection agent to come handle that? Would you pass it off to them? Or is that something where you guys say, we're not in the immigration business game, you're free to go?
Not necessarily we would call them. I mean, I think it all depends on the circumstances. I mean, when I was on the road, I stopped a lot of people that were from Quebec, and they at least alleged they couldn't speak English. And
it's probably true.
it probably was. And they were probably traveling through, but, they could have been illegal. I didn't know, so I did whatever I did, wrote a summons, wrote a warning, did whatever. And the same thing. I mean, people do vacation here and stuff. So again, there's no scarlet letter. If they have an individual that is broken the law state-wise, then they take care of their issue on a state charge. And then, like I said, forward that report to Customs and Border Patrol. Again, you get into sticky situations where you start saying that, well, this person can't speak English, they don't have a license, because they might be legal
And you don't want to engage in
know
profiling. I mean, that profiling is evil and abhorrent behavior in whatever context. Just because someone doesn't speak English doesn't mean anything about their nationality or their immigration status. But there are some indicators that somebody might be present in the country.
And that's why, I mean, you know, it all depends on the circumstance. I get this asked all the time. Do you call a border patrol? Well, no, not necessarily. I mean, you know, I think that if I saw certain things, then I would start, you know, questioning it. But, you know, the reality is that people do vacation here from other countries, you know, and there's a fine line. And then with immigration law, there's exceptions to everything. So it's kind of like, okay, you know, I remember to my stopping cars where they'd give me a passport and I'd look at it like, you know, and I mean, I knew people at ICE and I'm looking at it going, geez, I have no idea what the hell this is all about.
Do you get the international driver's licenses, the print online kind of?
You know, it's been a long time since I was on the road, but I mean, it always was. I thought immigration would give me a edge that I might be able to help them out. And what I learned is stay out of it because there's so many rules and there's so many exceptions. I mean, they lock people up for civil violations. In our world, that's a driver's license that's less than 160 days elapsed, or it's a speeding violation or something like that. We don't lock people up. They can. You know, and again, it's, you know, for some people it's like, oh, that's good. Well, but in our world, that isn't what we do, you know. So it's just so complicated. You know, as I was telling somebody the other day, their judges are ICE employees. Their prosecutors are ICE employees. I mean, it's just a total different system. We're used to prosecutors that are elected. We're used to judges that are appointed by, you know, presidents and governors, or, you know, in some cases, you go out west, elected judges and stuff. These are all employees of ICE. And so it's just completely different than what local law enforcement is even aware of.
And if you guys stopped cooperating with ICE, would the federal funding through the U.S. Marshals go away, or would you guys see a loss of funding if the activists that were at the Cumberland commissioners meeting the other day, if they got their way, would that result in a reduction in funding for you guys?
I don't know. I mean, you know, right now it's out of the about 100, 2/3 are ICE, so another third is Marshals. Supposedly my jail administrator, who has contact with the marshals, you know, through the contract, had called right after one of the meetings and said, hey, what's going on with this? And made some comment like, yeah, well, you know, if they do away with the contract, wait and see. You know, I don't know what that means. You know, again, our decisions are made on public safety, you know, and what I've seen in the last 8 months is political trying to control public safety. I try to make my decisions, and I've pissed off both sides of the aisle on some of my decisions around public safety. And it's been, how can I look you in the face and talk about public safety? And how can I get up in the middle of the night or in the morning and shave and look myself in the mirror and know that I'm doing the best job I possibly can, because that's what people have entrusted me to do. And, you know, this bill that's sitting on the governor's desk, I think this is, you know, if signed, is just one more notch of not allowing public safety to do the right thing. You know, we can't communicate with federal agencies. We can't communicate with ICE. I mean, you know, a couple of years ago, there was a bill that passed that said, hey, you know, if I run into a runaway and they came to Maine, you know, to have a sex change or an abortion or something like that, I can't communicate with other police departments. So it's like, what happens when I do that, and then next thing you know, the kid is face down in a ditch somewhere dead, you know, and they find out, well, geez, you know, I knew about it, but I couldn't tell.
Or it turns out they're a victim of sex trafficking, and their pimp was bringing them here for an abortion. I
mean, you know, sometimes just more often than not, politics is getting in the way of public safety. You know, our job is to try to do the best we can to keep everyone safe, you know, And Maine law enforcement, Maine EMS, Maine fire really take that seriously. But, sometimes it's difficult to get up and go to work for some of these folks just because you got somebody up here in Augusta that thinks they know your job better than you. And they don't even know where your police station is, let alone who you are. And that's a little frustrating. I used to enjoy coming up here and working with the legislators. Now it's everyone goes to their corner and nobody talks, and it's things have to change.
Why do you think that that changed to the political dynamic of the state house? What do you think that is?
It's I think that it doesn't take a rocket scientist to find out that if I don't agree with you, I'm not talking to you, and I hate you.
Yeah.
But
it didn't used to be that way. At some point, it and changed,
I don't know what
clicked.
that was.
Yeah.
I mean, I know that when we were up here, and we still come up, but sheriffs, police chiefs were called out into the lobby and go, "Hey, how's this going to affect you?" And it was both parties, and they got together and they did the right thing. And now it's all that haggling doesn't go on in the hallway. It goes on in some closed area, and sometimes it works for public safety and other times it doesn't, and I think that's the biggest frustration for me, as seeing this over a long period of time. Even as a chief deputy, I would come up here, and I enjoyed coming up and, seeing how the sausage was made, but being part of the decision making. But we just have, bills that are being thrown in that, how about giving the local chief or the local sheriff or somebody a call and saying, "Hey, I'm going to do this. How does that affect you?" But no, we get surprised by a bill coming up, and then we come up and either support it or not support it. And sometimes we win, sometimes we lose, but sometimes it's not in the best interest of public safety either.
I think one of the other areas where politics has imposed on the Cumberland County Sheriff's Office is through the elected DA. And most recently, that's Jackie Sartoris, who's been in the headlines a little bit. She had a assistant DA depart. There's been some criticism of her from the right, from the left. Portland City Councilor Wes Pelletier, who's a socialist, criticized her from a progressive perspective. There's been some anonymous letters sent to me criticizing her. It seems like the Cumberland DA office is in turmoil right now, and I'm sure that that's an office that you work with quite a bit. What's your relationship been like with the DA's office? I know I heard her on the radio a little while ago actually criticizing you for some of the problems that were happening in Portland, specifically with regard to homelessness. So I'm sure you have a relationship with that office. What's it been like over the last, 4 or 5 years? Well,
first of all, if that's the case, then sorely disappointed, because again, the homeless is, they do come to jail, and, we hold them as long as we can, but when they're due to be released, we have to release them. My relationship with, and I've worked with 3 DAs now, is generally at meetings. We sometimes will collaborate on issues. I know with DA Sartoris, there have been a couple of times where we've talked about various programs, and I've had to let her know that my staff are union. So in a union shop, you just don't pick staff members and put them wherever you want them, and I don't think, she's never had to deal with unions. She still doesn't deal with unions. So that is a foreign issue. As far as the turmoil, I mean, I had to hear about that when I came home from a conference last Wednesday of all this stuff, and, news to me. Like I said, my concerns have been, just on, hey, I just because you think I can move a person over here, we have a collective bargaining unit that I have to follow. And so I just can't do that, and trying to push back on that. Other than that, my staff usually deal with her staff, and it was news to me on what was going on in the office because it really hadn't trickled up to my level, I guess. My staff were a little concerned a couple of years ago or a year ago when there was not going to be prosecution on certain license type things. And
yeah, that was a big one. The basically the unilateral decriminalization of certain traffic offenses.
And I told my staff, I go, look, if you have a situation, only you know what you have, and it's still against the law to drive without a license or whatever. So you do what you have to do, because that's your discretion to do that. And if the DA's office wants to throw it out, then they'll throw it out. But I don't want you or us being, accused of not doing our job, when if somebody is bona fide violating the law, then you do what you have to do. Learned a long time ago that I do my job as part of the executive, and the judicial evaluates that at the end. And I don't take it personal if they throw it out or they no complain it, but I'm at least going to do my job and walk away knowing that I did what I had to do.
And I think the philosophy that the DA has embraced broadly can be called restorative justice. I know that there are a bunch of different tactics, philosophies, ideas that fall under that umbrella. But it's a philosophy that you see with a lot of different DA offices. I lived in Boston under Rachel Rawlins in Suffolk County. She actually put out a list of all the crimes that she wasn't going to prosecute. It was like 15 different things, including grand theft auto was a petty crime that she wasn't going to prosecute anymore. Where do you think what motivates that?
Well, I think, I've seen it with all three DAs I work with. DA Anderson had a program where she had bad checks. All right,
This was Stephanie Anderson, a Republican DA.
Yeah, and she came up with a program that bad checks would be handled a certain way. It seemed to work out well, and I call that restorative justice, because it was one area that generally wasn't going to get prosecuted unless the person really worked hard to, get her attention to prosecute it.
I don't think my generation really is familiar with bad checks.
Well, yeah, probably not. Probably not.
It's not much of a problem these days.
We had people that would write checks,
check kiting.
Yeah, and some people did it mistakenly. And obviously you didn't want to haul somebody in that did it mistakenly. And then some people did it as, hey, I'm going to see if I can get away with it. And that worked out. And that was a brand of restorative justice. Restorative justice has been big especially with juveniles, trying to, make sure that kids will be kids and they're going to do stupid things. And as long as they haven't done anything that's, real heinous, then, try to work with them. And some schools have a restorative justice group that they even try to handle bad behavior in the schools and stuff like that. So I think it has a value for certain crimes. But again, I don't think that every crime and large bulks of restorative justice is something that you can even get your hands around. I'd love to do a diversion where it's like, hey, I know that some of the people that we deal with, but for their substance use, they did something that, was craving that, and see if we could work on that. But I don't have the staff, and I don't think there's a lot of will right now to do that, because the court system got really backed up over COVID and nothing moved, so I'm not sure. I haven't crawled into her head to figure out what that is, but maybe some of it's to move that along. I think the court system is starting to move a little quicker. But, I'm involved with a case a homicide case that's been 5 years, before it gets, even to the court system. And, wheels of justice are moving kind of slowly. But it's not to blame the court system, because some of these individuals that we hold, they fire their attorneys, and then the new attorney has to start over again. And, so it's not necessarily the prosecutor or the judge. It's sometimes the defendant who is just not helping their case and stuff like that. So getting back to your restorative justice, I think it has its place, in limited cases, but, I don't think spending a whole lot of time, trying to recreate the wheel right now is, we got a lot of other issues to go on. Again, going back to mental illness and substance use.
Well, Sheriff Joyce, I know you have another appointment to attend to. I appreciate you taking some time to talk with us. This has been great. So thank you very much for coming
thanks
in.
for having me.